What?
Sir, this is first class. You need to move to your assigned seat.
For 12 harrowing minutes aboard Flight 482, a single voice shattered the calm of first class. "Sir, you don't belong here. Show me your real ticket or get out." Every man in that cabin felt it, the crack in civility that grows when authority sees a black man and judges. Robert Hayes, seated in 1A, immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit and a practiced calm, met the accusation with silence. Phones emerged. Whispers swelled. The flight crew hesitated as if the old rules could protect them. But this was no ordinary passenger. Minutes later, the engines would shut down, careers would lie in ruins, and millions would be glued to screens replaying every moment. How does a routine seat check ignite a fire that burns through corporate walls? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Who exactly was David Lawson? To some, he was just another face boarding a late evening flight, a sharply dressed man who carried himself with quiet authority. But behind that calm exterior was one of the most influential business leaders in America, a self-made CEO whose journey from a modest upbringing to the helm of a billion-dollar company was both celebrated and resented. This wasn't just a man with a ticket to first class. This was someone who had worked his entire life to earn it. So why, on that night, did the crew insist he didn't belong there? Why was his very presence treated like an offense that needed correction? What pushed this simple moment, a seat check, a boarding pass, to become a headline that would soon dominate news cycles across the country? And then there's the 12 minutes. 12 minutes that stretched like an eternity, broadcast through the shaky hands of passengers who pulled out their phones and streamed the confrontation in real time. 12 minutes where words turned to tension, tension into threats, and threats into consequences no one could have imagined. What exactly happened in that short span of time that cost a veteran pilot his job and a global airline its reputation? The answer, as we will soon uncover, may not lie entirely in the cabin that night, but in decisions and resentments that had been set in motion long before the boarding doors closed. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was it really an accident? Or was this confrontation part of something larger, something planned from the very beginning? What motive could possibly drive such a public humiliation, and who truly stood to gain from David Lawson being forced out of seat 1A? As the world would soon discover, this was more than a clash of ego on a crowded airplane. It was the opening move in a battle where corporate power, personal dignity, and racial injustice collided at 30,000 feet. David Lawson was 52 years old, a man whose very name carried weight in boardrooms across America. He was the CEO of a billion-dollar logistics empire, a company that moved freight across continents and kept industries alive with its precision. But his beginnings were far from the marble floors of corporate headquarters. Born into a working-class family in Detroit, Lawson grew up in a two-bedroom home where every dollar mattered. His father worked long shifts at a factory, and his mother held down two jobs to keep food on the table. From an early age, Lawson understood what discipline meant, not just as a virtue, but as a necessity. He built his career from the ground up, driven by the belief that excellence was the only answer to a world that doubted him. By the time he stepped into that first-class seat, he wasn't just a wealthy man, he was the embodiment of self-made success. Yet the industry he was flying in that evening had long been tainted by shadows. The airline business was no stranger to accusations of mistreatment, discrimination, and bias. Over the years, lawsuits had piled up, filed by passengers who claimed they were singled out or dismissed unfairly. Most were quietly settled, buried in non-disclosure agreements and corporate apologies that meant little. But David Lawson wasn't just a customer, he was an investigator in his own right. His company held contracts with airlines across the country, and he had begun looking deeper into how those companies treated people. The complaints weren't random. There was a pattern, and in the months leading up to Flight 482, Lawson had taken a particular interest in one airline whose internal culture seemed especially resistant to change. On the night of the flight, two names would prove critical in the story: Captain Thomas Reynolds, a man with 23 years in the cockpit, carried the confidence of an old-school pilot who believed his word was final. He valued authority over empathy, hierarchy over compromise. To him, questioning a captain's decision was nearly a crime in itself. Alongside him worked Kelly Burns, a flight attendant known for following every rule by the book. But passengers who flew under her care often noticed her mannerisms cold, rigid, and sometimes revealing the kind of bias that rarely makes it into official reports. Together, Reynolds and Burns represented the very culture Lawson had been studying, one that prized control at the expense of compassion. And perhaps the most telling detail of all, David Lawson booked this flight himself. No assistant arranged it. No secretary handled the details. Lawson deliberately chose this route, a commercial flight run by an airline whose operations were, in many ways, under the scrutiny of his own company's contracts. To the casual observer, it was a routine booking, but to Lawson, it was a test. He wanted to see how the airline treated its passengers when nobody knew who was sitting in 1A. He wanted to experience what others had complained about. What he did not know, or perhaps what he suspected, was that the test would not remain a quiet observation. It would explode into a confrontation that exposed far more than he anticipated. Boarding for Flight 482 began like any other evening departure. Families shuffled down the jet bridge, business travelers clutched laptops, and the hum of conversation filled the cabin. At the very front, in seat 1A, David Lawson settled into his place. His boarding pass had been scanned, his luggage stowed, his mind set on a quiet journey. But peace rarely lasts when perception outweighs truth. Kelly Burns, the flight attendant tasked with welcoming passengers, approached his row with a look that betrayed suspicion before a word was spoken. She paused, checked her tablet, and frowned. "Sir, you don't belong here," she said, her voice sharp enough to carry to the nearest rows. "First class is reserved. Show me your real ticket." Passengers turned, curiosity sparking into murmurs. Lawson met her gaze calmly, sliding the crisp boarding pass across the armrest. His composure only seemed to intensify her conviction that something was wrong. The exchange should have ended there with a scan, a nod, and an apology. But Kelly Burns leaned into the role of enforcer, determined to prove what her instincts told her. "This is not your seat," she repeated, louder this time, drawing more eyes. "You need to move." Lawson, unflinching, returned the pass to his pocket and sat back. "I'm exactly where I belong," he said evenly. The lack of reaction, the absence of anger, frustrated her more than any argument could. Whispers rippled through the cabin, phones appeared in hands, and within moments, the confrontation was being recorded. Livestreams flickered online, notifications spreading like sparks. A simple dispute between a passenger and a flight attendant was becoming something larger. An audience far beyond the airplane was tuning in to watch it unfold in real time. By the time Captain Thomas Reynolds left the cockpit and entered the cabin, the temperature of the moment had risen to breaking point. He was a man accustomed to obedience, a figure of authority who expected instant compliance. His jaw tightened as he scanned the scene. Burns standing rigid, Lawson composed but immovable, passengers with their phones raised like courtroom jurors. The captain's voice carried the weight of finality. "Sir, you're leaving this plane." The command silenced the whispers, but it did not silence David Lawson. He looked directly at Reynolds, his voice calm but edged with certainty. "No, Captain," he said, the words landing heavy in the charged air. "You'll be the one leaving." Gasps filled the cabin. For a moment, the roles seemed to reverse, the passenger holding ground, the captain standing on trial before an unseen jury of millions. And within minutes, that jury would deliver its verdict. When airport security finally stepped onto Flight 482, tension snapped into silence. Two officers moved down the aisle with the authority of men summoned to restore order, their eyes shifting from the captain to the passenger in 1A. David Lawson did not flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced a sleek, unmistakable American Express black card, laying it on the armrest beside his valid boarding pass. The room seemed to hold its breath. To most, that card was a symbol not just of wealth but of status few could imagine. Yet Kelly Burns crossed her arms, her words spilling out with cutting conviction. He doesn't look like first class. The officers froze, passengers gasped, and phones captured every syllable. Online, the phrase ignited. Screens across the country lit up with outrage, hashtags spreading in furious waves. First class while black. Ground, this flight. The cabin had become a courtroom, and the world was watching the verdict unfold in real time. Inside the airline's operations center, phones buzzed with urgency. Executives and managers, monitoring the live streams and chatter, dialed into the cockpit. Their instructions to Captain Thomas Reynolds were clear and measured. Handle this quietly. Do not escalate. Do not let this become tomorrow's headline. But Reynolds, rooted in his conviction that authority was absolute, dug in deeper. "Sir, you will leave this plane," he repeated, his voice cutting with the edge of command. For a man who had flown for 23 years, there was no room for compromise, no tolerance for challenge. His insistence that Lawson comply despite the evidence before him, despite the corporate voices urging caution, only fueled the chaos further. What might have ended with an apology was transforming into an incident that would reshape reputations, careers, and even the very airline itself. By the 12th minute, with the confrontation reaching its boiling point, David Lawson slowly leaned forward and placed his leather briefcase on the tray before him. The world held its breath. With deliberate precision, he clicked it open. Inside, not only his corporate identification documents, but legal filings stamped with the power of his office. More than that, he activated a video call on his tablet, tilting the screen so that Captain Reynolds and the stunned crew could see the faces staring back. Members of the airline's own board of directors appeared, their voices crackling through the cabin speakers. Gasps erupted from passengers, security officers stiffened, and Kelly Burns stepped back as if struck. Lawson's words cut through the silence, calm but devastating. "Before you make another mistake, Captain, look at my title." The silence that followed David Lawson's words was heavier than any turbulence. On the screen inside his briefcase, the faces of executives filled the cabin, men and women whose signatures had shaped the very airline carrying Flight 482. Their voices were sharp with disbelief and fury. "Why is our chairman being treated like a criminal?" The title landed like thunder. David Lawson wasn't simply a CEO of a logistics empire. He was the chairman of the board of the very airline now trying to throw him out of seat 1A. Gasps erupted from the passengers. Some lowered their phones in shock, others raised them higher, determined to capture every frame of a revelation that no one could have scripted. Authority flipped in an instant. The man the crew had dismissed as out of place was, in fact, the highest-ranking figure in the company. Security officers froze, their postures shifting from command to caution. The decision they thought they had come to enforce was now impossible to carry out. One officer stepped back, muttering into his radio, unwilling to move against the chairman of the board. Kelly Burns, her face flushed, stared at the screen before covering her mouth with trembling hands. The weight of what she had said, "He doesn't look like first class," crashed down on her. Tears welled as she tried to speak, but the words fell apart before they could form. Around her, passengers whispered in disbelief, some even cheering as the power dynamics shifted before their eyes. Online, the livestream exploded past 100,000 viewers, the comments section drowning in outrage and vindication. This was no longer a private dispute, it was a global reckoning. For Captain Thomas Reynolds, the revelation landed like a blow to the chest. 23 years in the cockpit, thousands of hours in the air, and yet his decision was about to unravel everything. The confidence he had carried into the cabin just minutes before was gone, replaced by the creeping realization that his authority had turned into liability. The cameras captured his every movement, the stern jawline now slack with dread. Passengers who once obeyed his commands now looked at him with contempt. Every second the live stream ticked on, his career dangled by a thinner thread. He had demanded that the chairman of his own airline leave the plane. Now the question wasn't if he would pay for it, but how steep the cost would be. As the cabin buzzed with disbelief, David Lawson finally leaned back in his seat, the weight of the moment no longer hidden. His voice was steady, deliberate, as he revealed the truth that would leave the airline world reeling. This was no accident, no coincidence. The confrontation on Flight 482 was a test one he had orchestrated with precision. In the past quarter alone, the airline had received 47 separate complaints of racial discrimination, each brushed aside with apologies and denials. Lawson had grown tired of reports and paperwork. He wanted proof. He wanted to know with his own eyes how his employees treated passengers when titles and power weren't attached to a boarding pass. And tonight, he got his answer. They had failed. Failed spectacularly in front of passengers, in front of cameras, and in front of the entire world. The verdict was swift and decisive. Lawson closed his briefcase, turned to the officers still hovering by the aisle, and gave a single order. Ground this flight. His words carried more authority than any captain's announcement, and within minutes, the aircraft's engines powered down. Passengers erupted in applause, some rising to their feet in cheers as the balance of control shifted once and for all. Security officers, now recognizing the chain of command, stepped forward not toward Lawson, but toward Captain Thomas Reynolds. The man who had once commanded obedience was escorted down the aisle, his head bowed, the eyes of every passenger locked on him as he disappeared from view. For Kelly Burns, tears streaked her cheeks as the reality of her actions settled in. A career defined by rigid adherence to the rules had been undone in 12 minutes of bias. No one applauded her exit. Even as the cabin settled, the storm outside was just beginning. With cameras still streaming and reporters already dialing in, Lawson instructed his communications team on the live call with the board to draft a press release immediately. The headline was as devastating as it was historic. Southwest Airlines chairman exposes discrimination on his own flight. Within hours, the statement would be published across news outlets worldwide, igniting debates, protests, and calls for reform across the aviation industry. For passengers on Flight 482, the story was already legend. They had witnessed not only a confrontation, but a reckoning, a powerful figure stripping away his title to experience the truth, and then using that truth to shatter a culture of denial. The scandal rocked the airline to its core, leaving an indelible mark on every corner of the industry. David Lawson didn't just buy a ticket. He bought the truth. In those 12 minutes aboard Flight 482, a mirror was held up to an entire industry, and what it revealed could not be denied. The humiliation, the confrontation, the insistence that a man in a $1,000 suit didn't look like first class, all of it became evidence of something larger than one flight or one crew. Lawson's decision to step into the role of an ordinary passenger forced the world to watch what so many had claimed for years but struggled to prove. In the end, he didn't need to raise his voice or demand recognition. The truth revealed itself in front of millions, and its impact will forever be etched into the story of modern air travel. But here's the question that lingers long after the engines went quiet. If the cameras hadn't been rolling, would justice have ever been served? Would the voices of those 47 passengers who complained before him have finally been heard? Or would their stories have remained hidden, buried beneath polished apologies and closed files? The presence of witnesses, the power of livestreams, and the courage of one man willing to sit silently until the right moment, all of these collided to create change. But was this justice, or was it simply accountability born from visibility? That is the question only you, the viewer, can answer. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when another billionaire tested his staff in the most unusual way, uncovering a truth that left even his closest allies in tears. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe because the next story may just leave you speechless.